Movies. So it was really interesting that I saw an opera this week that had to do with the devil kind of tempting a guy and making him do all sorts of crazy stuff and giving him promises and tricking him. It's a classic story, so of course it appears in many other forms, and I rewatched just because it was on HBO Now, and I'm giving the HBO Now thing a 1-month trial. Check that out if you have no idea what I'm talking about. HBO Go versus HBO Now. But Devil's Advocate, which I've only seen once before, probably at too young of an age. I was probably 13 or so, which stars Keanu Reeves and Al Pacino, and I think I saw The Matrix and The Godfather fairly close to each other, and so it was so exciting to be like, oh, there's a movie with Neo and, The Godfather. So when I was a kid, I didn't feel like I took it all in, and again, this is a fairly straightforward story. Keanu Reeves plays a small-town lawyer, not a small town, from Gainesville, Florida, who, has never lost a case, and then gets invited up to work in a big law firm up in New York, run by Al Pacino. Now, I'm just going to spoil this because it's a movie from the 90s, I just want to give my thoughts on it. So it turns out Al Pacino's the devil, and everything he's tempting him with, of course, is not good stuff. And when Keanu Reeves starts to break down at the end and be like, why did you do this to me? As the devil is wont to do sometimes, he says, look, you could have prevented all of this stuff. Like, you could have made better choices. You could have cared more about your wife. Charlize Theron in this, for some reason, plays the only person that can kind of see all the satanic things going on, which just makes Keanu Reeves and everyone else think she's crazy. I don't know why she was able to see these things that no one else could, like demon faces and that kind of stuff. Maybe because she was just so pure and innocent that somehow that stuff reads to her better. But that was kind of strange. I liked the beginning of her story where she comes from a poor family and has always spent her life working, and then suddenly she's in New York with a multi-million-dollar apartment, and all she really has time to do is decorate and meet people who she doesn't really get along with. So that was kind of interesting, but then kind of became a weird story thread at the end when it just seems like she's going insane. But the main thing I'm not sure about how I feel about with this movie is it turns out Al Pacino is Keanu Reeves' father in this. And for me, and this is probably based on a book, but it's more interesting if this is just Satan finding a person who he thinks he has the ability to tempt and doing some interesting things to that person, because then it becomes kind of an everyman thing, and we can all relate to the idea of wanting to be ambitious and not knowing where the line is and when we're hurting others, and that struggle. Breaking Bad's a classic thing of that. But by having Keanu Reeves be Satan's son, he's already Satan's offspring, that immediately removes, I think, the audience a step from that character's journey. And then there's this whole incest thing at the end where, he's been attracted to his sister the whole time. We didn't know it was his sister, and now he's trying to get them to mate and, in theory, spawn the Antichrist, which on paper, maybe that sounds like a really exciting finale, but it's just weird. It didn't ring that well for me the way the rest of the movie did. But anyway, it's an old movie. Check it out. I still think the acting's fantastic. Keanu Reeves is absolutely doing his Keanu Reeves thing. Very monotone, but Al Pacino is fantastic. He's a great devil. If nothing else, watch it just for him. Charlize Theron's also very good. So, Devil's Advocate, I'm giving it 3 stars with a confidence of 4. So just very quick, also on HBO Now right now is Fast and the Furious 6. Now, a friend of mine saw this movie when it was in theaters, and he was like, this is the best Fast and the Furious movie that has ever come out. I saw the very first Fast and the Furious movie when it came out when I was 12 or whatever, and thought it was fine. I enjoyed it enough, but never had any desire to see any of the sequels. But my friend's recommendation was so strong for Fast and Furious 6 that I just was like, okay, sure. It was on HBO. I don't have to pay anything for it. Why don't I give it a watch? And I started watching it, and I think I watched an hour of it, and none of it was connecting with me. I like a lot of those actors in other things I've seen them in, and maybe it's like a Metal Gear Solid thing where you really should be watching all the movies and paying close attention to all the plot threads, because I just wasn't invested in anything these characters were doing. And after an hour, and I saw it's a 2-hour and 40-minute movie or something like that, I'm like, I can't watch this for another hour and 40 minutes. There's so many other great things to watch. So I stopped. So that's it. Fast and Furious 6. I give it 1 star with a confidence of 0. On Netflix, I watched a movie called They Came Together, which I remember hearing about a couple years ago because it was right around the time when in Parks and Recreation, Amy Poehler and Paul Rudd had an awesome plot line where they're running for city councilor against each other, and Paul Rudd's doing his adorable, rich kid thing, I'm just a nice guy, but I don't know what's going on. And Amy Poehler's needs to beat him, but doesn't want to do it in a mean way. So that was a fantastic season of Parks and Recreation. I was excited to see them together in a movie. The movie is basically them at dinner with some friends explaining the story of their relationship, and it is a giant send-up of all the cliches and pastiches and things that we see in romantic comedies and those kinds of movies. It was funny, and the acting was great, and the writing was fine, but something about it, maybe just the delivery of everything, there's a certain snarkiness to the whole thing that kind of took a lot of the fun out of it. And I, as someone that loves parody and satire, there was something about the way that this was parodying and satirizing romantic comedies and those kinds of movies that in many ways made it less fun than the things that it's parodying or satirizing. And I'm not even someone that really likes romantic comedies, but it's the best analogy I can come up with. It's like, imagine you go see a standard, totally run-of-the-mill romantic comedy in a movie with someone, and they're sitting next to you, and the entire time they're kind of whispering in your ear like, yeah, this is just like those 3 other movies. Oh, that character's just like this other character from that other movie. And maybe at first you're like, oh, yeah. And then it just gets kind of grating, and you're like, look, I just want to sit down and lose myself in this for a little bit. Let me put, you know what, I'm making it sound like I like romantic comedy movies. I've never in my life gone out of my way to see a romantic comedy, but for some reason this movie made me want to defend them. It's a funny movie. Again, funny script, funny jokes, but it just kind of left a weird taste in my mouth by the end. I didn't feel like I really got anything out of it of significance. So, you know, it's tough for me to recommend it. I laughed a fair amount, but I don't have any desire to see it again or show it to people or recommend it. So I think I'm going to give it 2 stars with a confidence of 4. Okay, Avengers, Age of Ultron, Joss Whedon, one of my favorite people in the universe, all sorts of actors in this movie that I adore, and I love the characters. And what did I think of it? I will tell you in a minute, but first I want to say that there are going to be some spoilers. I'll try to keep them to the end. So if you haven't seen the movie, watch for when I do something like this, and that means there's going to be spoilers. I've been looking forward to this movie for a long time, and my wife knows that, and she's been looking forward to it too, so much so that she gave me a fantastic present for Christmas, which was a bunch of cards where each card was a date night, and saying on this night we're going to have this fun experience together, and it's a really nice variety of things that leads right up until we have our first child, and it's really exciting to, you know, have that variety of things. And this is the only movie out of all those date nights. This is the only thing where we're like, yes, we should go down and just watch a movie and enjoy it. So, hear that? That's an owl. So, what did I think overall? I liked it. I liked it a lot. I didn't like it as much as the first Avengers movie, and I'm struggling to articulate why. The best analogy I've come up with so far is the Avengers 1, first of all, wasn't supposed to work. No one thought that that was going to be a good idea to have all these separate superhero movies and then throw all these characters together and say, go on an adventure now. And the fact that it did work, and it worked surprisingly well in a really clean way, blew everyone's mind. So first of all, the second movie doesn't have that going for it, that it doesn't get to surprise us in the same way. But also but maybe tonally, the first movie had a really clear thrust to it, and I knew what I was in, 5 minutes into it, and it went beyond just knowing I was in a Joss Whedon movie. It felt like it made sense for these characters to be on this journey together, and that worked out really well. And that to me was the best equivalent I can come up with, is like eating a great bowl of high quality cookie dough ice cream, where like the vanilla ice cream and the chocolate chips and the cookie dough, all fantastic, and it gives you that unified flavor of like, this is a great cookie dough ice cream, and all those different little pieces represent the different elements that blended together really well into a unified whole. Avengers Age of Ultron felt like going to one of those Avengers Age of Ultron felt like going to one of those do-it-yourself frozen yogurt stands, which I go to a lot, and my wife and I actually went to one right after the movie. And here's what I usually do at those things, is they have all these choices of all these different flavors and all these different toppings, and the toppings go from candy to fruit, and the flavors go from tart or non-fat vanilla to caramel dulce de leche. And what I tend to do is I go through and I do like 8 flavors and like 9 different toppings, and I do some kiwis, and I do some chocolate chips, and I do some mochi, and it's just a big giant mashup of all these things that I like. And that's kind of what this movie felt like to me, is all the elements are like, I like this, and I like this, and I like this, but it didn't hold together as well, I think. So like the ice cream, sometimes just a single flavor can be more satisfying than having all the different elements mixed together. See, in the first Avengers movie, they are bonding together not because they want to, but because they have to. There is an external threat facing the Earth that they've never had to deal with before, and they realize that the only way that they can stop it is by working together. together, and the way that all comes together is really well done. At the beginning of this movie, they are a pseudo-functioning family and seem to be doing well. And then Tony, for some reason, starts thinking, hey, you know what? We should try to be obsoleting ourselves. Why don't I try to make something that's going to make it so we're not necessary anymore? And then, obviously, because we've all seen the trailers, we know that's going to go horribly wrong. Luckily, it gets pretty quickly to the creation of Ultron. And then the rest of the movie, of course, is trying to stop Ultron. And I just need to say, there is something inherently less satisfying about watching the Avengers clean up a mess that they created than facing an external threat. And again, piece by piece, everything I think worked. If you pull out every scene, I can tell you a bunch of things I like about that scene. If you pull out the entire, storyline of the movie, I can tell you that I liked it and I think it worked. A lot of people have talked about how bloated the movie felt or how it felt like too many things started and then weren't developed. I didn't really feel that way. Like, I think for the most part, the narrative pulled you along pretty cleanly without too many questions. There were a few moments that were clearly not meant for this movie, but was setting up the later stuff, the stuff with Thor in the Infinity Pool, and of course, at the end we get more stuff with whatever. Anyway, action sequences. Here's a weird thing. The trailers before this movie included, among others, Ant-Man, the new Mission Impossible movie, Fantastic Four, and Jurassic World. And every single one of those trailers is a non-stop barrage of action. So by the time the movie started, especially because the movie opens with an action sequence raiding a Hydra base, Liz and I were already burnt out on action. And, luckily this wasn't some Michael Bay movie where action was the only point of the movie, but it made it much less exciting to watch the action sequences. Also, a big part of enjoying an action sequence for me is the music done right. I thought the first Avengers movie, the music was done very well. I love the theme, the da 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 da. And in this movie, there was nothing about the music that really worked for me. It's funny too because there were 3 composers credited, including Danny Elfman and Alvin Silvestri and another guy. And I guess from what I understand, there was some strife on the composing sides of things. But there wasn't any new themes that I found particularly memorable. Even the way the old theme was used wasn't used particularly well. There weren't any real hero moments. And let's talk about moments for a second. Joss Whedon has talked about the difference between moments and movements, and you move something to get to a moment, but the moment should always grow organically out of the movement, blah, blah, blah. You are welcome to hear Joss Whedon talk about those things. And he says there were a lot of moments that were cut from the film because they didn't fit as well into the movement, which I understand in theory, but the problem with that is one of the things that made the first Avengers movie so charming is there were so many memorable, perfect moments. Big one that comes to mind, everyone loved it, Hulk facing off against Loki, puny god. There was nothing in this movie that even came close to the magic of that. And I do say magic, like that was a singular experience to see in the movie theater for the first time, and it still makes my wife and I crack up every time we see it. We watched the old Avengers again last night just to compare and contrast, and this did feel like a Joss Whedon movie. The dialogue felt Joss Whedon-y, the plot line, the way things played out felt very much like Joss Whedon, but there was a certain X factor, if you will, a magic to the first movie that this one just did not have. For example, spoilers! Now we're going into spoilers. The death, okay? So Coulson dies in the Avengers, and he kind of comes back, but don't worry about that. Pretend you'd only ever seen the Avengers. That worked as a death in the movie because he was a character that had been through all of Phase 1 of the Marvel movies, starting with Iron Man and then right up toward the Avengers, and I think people had a lot of affection toward him. So that death resonated. It really, made sense as something that everyone would kind of pull together and work as a thing to rally behind. The death in Avengers 2, first of all, is a casualty of war, and the problem is that it's Quicksilver, which was a character that wasn't super developed in this film, and that's no fault at all of Aaron Taylor Johnson because he was fantastic in Kick-Ass, and even, I remember him as far back as The Illusionist playing young Edward Norton, which is kind of interesting because Edward Norton was also supposed to be the Hulk in the Avengers, so that would have been interesting if they were interacting in some parallel universe where Edward Norton stayed as the Hulk. But anyway, if you compare the characterization of Quicksilver in X-Men Days of Future Past, also played by a Kick-Ass actor, which is hilarious, from the movie Kick-Ass, that's what I mean by that. And then this one with Aaron Taylor Johnson, there's just not much to the character. Both him and his sister, Scarlet Witch, are kind of your standard Eastern European kids who lost their home. And that sounds kind of silly or racist or something, but there's not a lot of depth to them, and they're not developed in a very interesting way. Quicksilver in X-Men Days of Future Past didn't have a ton of screen time, but you got him, and he felt fresh, and he felt interesting, and if he had died in that movie, I think it actually would have been much more powerful than the way Quicksilver dies in Ultron. And, the other problem with that is because we don't see bullet time as much in Ultron, it's kind of weird to accept that he's, manages to get shot a bunch of times, because if we saw that in super slow motion, and if he can move as fast as Quicksilver as he was portrayed in X-Men Days of Future Past, it doesn't seem like he should have had to have died in order to rescue Hawkeye and the little boy or whatever. So, first of all, it's a casualty of war, not an inciting thing that sparks everyone doing something. So that made it a less powerful death. And then as a much less developed character, it also was less powerful. On a logical level, if you had to kill one of the Avengers, it makes total sense for it to be him, A, because he only exists in this movie, but B, because if you really think about his power, he is too powerful. He is a one-man Deus Ex Machina able to fix any problem. And if you watch the Honest Trailer or the How It Should Have Ended video for X-Men Days of Future Past, they do a great job of going over, if he had been there for the whole stuff with Mystique and everything with Richard Nixon and all that, Quicksilver could have solved all the problems. So, of course, they just left him out of that. And so by introducing Quicksilver, because I guess you have to introduce him and Scarlet Witch together since they're brother and sister, and now killing him, maybe it becomes useful because then Scarlet Witch has something to live for and become more interesting in the later movies. So we'll see how that goes. The Eastern European accents, by the way, were distractingly inconsistent. I had no idea what it was supposed to sound like, but sometimes it sounded American and sometimes it sounded vaguely Eastern European, but wasn't quite sure what to make of that. The other problem with Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver is, as my wife pointed out, she said this movie started to feel a little bit more like an X-Men movie, which makes total sense since those characters are also X-Men. And it got me thinking that I kind of miss the earlier days of Marvel, I guess you could say the first Iron Man movie, where there were no supernatural elements and there were no crazy mutant powers or even aliens, and you just had a guy like Tony Stark using nothing but his wits, building a frickin' suit, and becoming a quote-unquote superhero through the power of his own mind and his own thinking. And there was something really refreshing about that when it first came out, when you contrast that to, Superman and some of these other superhero characters that have some somewhat unbelievable powers. And now that, we got introduced to aliens and everything, which was fine, which made sense because we had Thor and everything that happened in the Avengers, that all worked. But it made the movie feel a little bit more comic booky and a little bit more like, oh, everyone has crazy powers, and it kind of took some of the weight off of everything, some of the stakes. So that's one thing that I think, again, even back in the Avengers, because the aliens were a new thing, and that was kind of the first supernatural element that many of the characters had ever dealt with, it had more weight in that capacity, whereas here, it makes the characters less sympathetic, and it makes the characters less interesting in some ways because we're not able to relate to them as well. So that's pretty much it. A few quick character things. It was so nice to see Paul Bettany as the Vision. I think the Vision is a really fascinating character, and even though it wasn't explored much in this movie, the idea of a supernatural, artificial intelligence being that cares above all else about human life has a huge myriad of interesting conflicts and potential run-ins with the Avengers or whatever, so I look forward to seeing what happens with that, if he's going to play in a role in Captain America Civil War or whatever. The love story stuff between Black Widow and Bruce Banner was fine, wasn't a huge fan of it. Similarly to the stuff with Hawkeye and his wife, it was fine. I didn't think it added a whole lot to the film. James Spader, I think, was fantastic as Ultron, really brought a lot of presence to a animated robot character, gave him the perfect level of malevolence and intelligence, so that all worked great. Just, in some ways inherently not as fascinating as a character like Loki, if for no other reason because Tom Hiddleston with that frickin' smile is amazing. Such a good actor. I missed Loki, and it would have been cool to see him a little bit in this movie. But that brings me to, I know Loki filmed some scenes in this. I am looking forward to seeing Joss Whedon's longer cut of the film. This movie ran 2.5 hours. Time flew by. It didn't feel at all like a bloated movie like other people have said. It felt like a movie that certainly had a lot more stuff going on than they were able to touch on, and I'm sure there's longer scenes and probably some deleted scenes, and I look forward to seeing what the longer version looks like. And it might be like the Lord of the Rings extended edition, only the original ones, who cares about the Hobbit ones, and I'm just going to, from now on, only watch the extended edition of Age of Ultron. It is a movie that in, 10 years from now, I could say I could totally imagine myself liking it just as much as the original Avengers, which is more of like just a good time popcorn movie, and this wanted to give you a little bit more to think about, and in some ways it succeeded, in some ways it failed, but no matter what, it still worked, still a Joss Whedon movie. They're both great. For now, Avengers Age of Ultron, I'm going to give it 4 stars with a confidence of 2, and since I just rewatched the original Avengers again last night, I'm still going to give that 5 stars with a confidence of 4.